Good afternoon and good morning to those joining us out west. I'm Karen Langdon with the National Emergency Management Association. Welcome to the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series. We're grateful you're joining us today. NEMA is very fortunate to include amongst its members some of the most experienced and knowledgeable experts in the emergency management field, and we're very excited to bring you this series to help share their wealth of knowledge and expertise and work towards a more prepared, resilient, and ready nation. Today, we're happy to present From Data to Decisions, Advanced Flood Risk Modeling for Stronger Emergency Management Planning and Response. Thank you so much to Fathom for supporting today's topic. Thank you again for being with us today. And now it's my pleasure to pass the session to our speakers, Gavin Lewis and Jeff Brislow. Welcome, Gavin and Jeff. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Karen, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I'm Gavin Lewis, the Head of Engineering at Fathom, and I work with a number of federal and state organisations and partners like WSP to get the best out of our flooding and climate maps and models. I've worked with emergency management teams here in the UK and in the US and was part of the Ordnance Survey, that's the UK's National Mapping Agency's critical event response team, providing mapping data for a wide range of natural and man-made incidents and events across the UK. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Jeff Brislow from WSP for his detailed practitioner's perspective that we'll talk about a bit later. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks, Gavin, and welcome everyone. My name's Jeff Brislow. I work at WSP. I've been a consultant in hazard mitigation and emergency management for 21 years. Prior to joining the consultants world, I was 10 years at the Colorado Office of Emergency Management and also did a couple of years as a FEMA disaster assistance employee. So my background is in a combination of geoscience, GIS, and emergency management, and have been working with clients around the U.S. to help them become more resilient to floods as well as other hazards, and looking forward to speaking to you about some of this experience today.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So part of what we want to really talk about today is really set out some learnings for the presentation. Firstly, it's really trying to understand some of the limitations of traditional flood data sets and learn about new alternative data sets that are available to provide both a current and a future perspective of flood risk at both a national, regional and local scale. We're taking that data and really looking at how we can provide practical examples of how this data can be used to support a wide range of emergency management applications. And finally, what we want to do is help you learn how to turn this mapping data really into actionable intelligence for the services that you provide. Next slide, please. I'd like to give you a bit of an overview, firstly, about Fathom. We effectively build flood maps and models to show the flow of water across the Earth's surface, both today and under future climate scenarios. Everything we do is underpinned by leading scientific research. We were formed over 10 years ago out of the University of Bristol by a team of world-leading flood scientists, really to develop the aim of providing a global understanding of water risk intelligence. And because of the academic background, research has been a constant thread in everything we do. All our methodologies and the validation of our data sets we publish in the leading scientific journals. We publish also a wide range of peer-reviewed scientific papers. So we're very open and transparent about our methodology. And if you would like to dive into that, how we develop our data sets, then I would suggest you go to our website and encourage you to look at our papers. So because of the scientific background, we were acquired 2 years ago by Swiss Re, one of the largest reinsurance companies globally. So we recently announced a new partnership, a new strategic partnership with WSP. What this does is effectively gives any team in WSP globally access to our flood maps and models and terrain data. So effectively, they can apply this high resolution climate condition data to their particular platforms and workflows, enabling them to provide a better support for their clients for flood and climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience planning. So let me hand over next to Jeff to talk a bit about WSP. Next slide, please.
For those of you that may not be familiar with WSP, we are actually one of the largest global provider of engineering and professional environmental services, and we have over almost 20,000 folks in the U.S., a lot of offices spread around the country. And we work in a lot of different sectors, including state and local governments, federal, and power and energy and transportation. And in everything that WSP does, we have what we call a future-ready strategy that we bring to our clients in every project to prepare, make sure that we're preparing our clients for changes in, whether it be changes in climate, society, or technology and resources. We're known in the flood mapping and modeling world as well as being a provider for flood hazard mapping and for not just for FEMA, but for also the cooperating technical partners, 14 different states we've worked with for over 20 years in the mapping and modeling business. Also have a leading hazard mitigation practice with hazard mitigation planning for supporting state and local governments. Next slide. So some of the areas that WSP provides in emergency management services is across the full spectrum of the emergency management cycle, from preparedness, mitigation, and response and recovery. You might see WSP responding to large hurricanes. We have contracts that enable us to restore emergency power after disasters, including the recent Midwestern ice storms and some of the hurricanes last year. I work a lot on the hazard mitigation side of things. We've developed 11 state hazard mitigation planning efforts. 4 of these enhanced and have been on a lot of update cycles, over 20 efforts. But we also provide training and exercises and operations planning as well. And the climate resilience and sustainability aspect of our business is really core. Again, helping our clients understand how they can be resilient in the face of changing climate conditions. Next slide, please. And on the topic of that, this slide kind of sets the stage why better flood intelligence is needed for mitigation and emergency operations purposes. This shows NOAA data that's been aggregated over since basically 1980 of the billion-dollar disasters that have resulted from weather events. So this doesn't include things like earthquakes or wildfires, but floods are shown there in blue, as well as severe storms and hurricanes. And as we know, those storms also usually result in flooding as well. So back in the 80s, we were on, $2 or $3 billion disasters was the norm, where now it's more like a dozen or more per year. So there's various trends that are causing this increase, but the need is pretty clear that we have to try to reverse these as much as possible. That things aren't really getting better in terms of disasters, and you all on this call, I'm sure, face this every day in the line of work you do. Next slide.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I want to pick up on Jeff's theme there, really around the issues and the trends that we're all facing in these types of environments, and trying to put that into context through some research that Fathom has done at a national scale for the US. If we start off at the the rise in average annual loss nationally between now and 2050, we're looking at an average of about 28% across the whole of the US. But some states are seeing a much higher projected flood losses between now and 2050, with some of the biggest states being Louisiana with nearly 150% increase, Florida at just under 75%, South Carolina at 58%, and Texas just over 45%. So we can see there are a number of states that we anticipate that the losses are only going to get increase due to the evolving weather patterns. This is before we're taking into consideration population growth and urbanization. But if we look at the coverage of data that is available currently, there's only about 60% of the continental US is covered by FEMA data. And a significant proportion of that is older than 10 years old. So there are some states that only have a relatively small or area of the state mapped due to flooding. Idaho with about 33%, Utah 50%, and Maine at 50% of the state is mapped for flooding. So you could see there's large gaps that are there. And even though there is FEMA coverage in some states, including Nevada, New Hampshire, and Arizona, over 90% of the FEMA data is older than 10 years. So it's not just the coverage, it's the vintage of the data that we need to consider there. I talked about financial losses, but that only really tells part of the picture. They do not really capture the human cost of flooding. And so, again, between 2020 and 2050, we're seeing large increases in population exposure, particularly in Iowa, with an eye-watering 276% increase, Georgia, 236%, North and South Dakota around 220%, and Kansas over 200%. So we can see that there are going to be greater impacts to populations due to changing weather patterns. And of course, it's not just the population. One of the key elements that we've got to consider as part of this is the infrastructure exposure. And quite a lot of that infrastructure is vulnerable to extreme weather conditions. Now, it's not just the impact of the infrastructure and the recovery and rebuilding, but of course, we need to use that infrastructure to respond to these types of emergencies that are impacting us. And so we can see in states like West Virginia, about 18% of the road network is going to be impacted by flood risk. Louisiana, it's over 12%. Now that may not seem significant or large percentages, but when you consider the road network and the accessibility, that is going to have serious impacts going forward for these types of events. Next slide, please. So what do these high-resolution flood hazard data sets really look like? To build any decent flood hazard data set, you need to have a very detailed digital elevation model. So to do that, Fathom have developed a data set that has pulled in all the open source LiDAR data across the US and has developed that and built that into a seamless terrain data set. Where there is no LiDAR, we have infilled with a new data set that has been developed using machine learning that has been validated against a whole range of other data sets. Now that gives us the coverage of pretty much 96% of the properties in the US are covered by LiDAR data. So we know that we're getting the best data to underpin the flood models. So the actual flood model itself has been validated. It's been developed, this large-scale mapping for the whole of the US, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, at 10-meter resolution for a range of return periods between the high frequency 1 in 5 year right the way through to the 1 in 1,000 year extreme events. Now, we model those data sets, the sub-perils quite differently between the river flooding, the fluvial flooding, the pluvial flash flooding, or the coastal flooding, all modeled in using 2D methodologies, using a modeling engine that's very close to the HECRAS type 2D modeling. In fact, the model that we use is effectively the grandfather of the HECRAS 2D modeling engine. And we provide a perspective both today and up to the end of the century, to 2100, under a range of different climate conditions. So we can give you today's view, but also that future view of flood risk. Next slide, please. So what does this data actually look like? And how does it compare to FEMA? So on the image you can see here, we've got an area of FEMA mapping that gives us quite a broad extent for the fluvial data. But on the right-hand side, you can see the level of detail that the data that we've developed actually provides. So it's not just the extents, it's providing the depths as well. And it's not just the depths for the 1 in 100 year event or the 1 in 500 year event. It's for a range of different return periods between high frequency and the extreme events. So we can see how the impact of these types, different levels of severity of event can impact the assets that we manage and respond to. So it's not, as you can see on the right-hand side, it's not just the main river channels. We also cover the smaller river channels as well, and the flash flooding. So you can see really the very detailed river networks there, and also the areas that are going to be impacted by flash flooding. And as I said, it's providing that consistent view of flood risk that is up to date, and also giving that current and future view. What we're saying here is really this complements and fills in the gaps to the data that you're currently using. So you can have that more complete picture and understanding of the flood risk to underpin the activities that you're engaged in on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. So how does these types of data sets really help you improve your hazard awareness? Well, effectively, we're moving from just straightforward flood boundaries to what we call more actionable intelligence. And that's really looking at identifying critical infrastructure. So which elements or assets of that critical infrastructure are going to be impacted. And we've got an example a little later on of the work we've done in Florida to that extent. But it's also identifying the interdependencies between critical infrastructure networks and key points of failure. Our data has been used in a UK national digital twin program to identify specific failure nodes of critical infrastructure at a national scale. But it's not just identifying them, it's then understanding those cascading failures. So what fails, in what order, and what are the knock-on effects of those consequences, and how do we prioritize those interventions? So it's very much a shift from hazard mapping to more system-level risk modeling and resilience planning. When we're looking at vulnerable populations, looking at an equity in response, it's looking at identifying where potentially LD populations need transportation, or low-income neighbourhoods may be lacking flood insurance that need different types of response, or looking at where mobile homes are large mobile homes parked that may be at high risk to flooding. Or it could be looking at identifying hospital and care homes where you need a different type of response to a flooding event than you would perhaps to standard residential areas. But it's also then underpinning that. How can we get a much better understanding of planning for those types of events, not just sort of evacuation procedures, but positioning of resources, and maybe where they need to be deployed, but also where they shouldn't be deployed because of the impact of flooding. And then looking at pre-deployment at an event level for things like sandbags and pumps and high water vehicles. So what we're trying to do is provide that more realistic worst case scenario planning, because we have those different return periods, and we're looking at both pluvial, fluvial and coastal flooding to provide a much more consistent view of flood risk to support those actions around planning and mitigation of these and responding to these types of events. Next slide, please. So this is just one example where our data has been used to identify the impact of flooding across the transport networks for Washington, D.C. And you can see here in the images where the FEMA data identified infrastructure at high, medium, and low risk, and compare that to the Fathom data, where we have a much more comprehensive data set, providing a much more detailed and consistent view of flood risk. And you can see there some of the stats comparing the FEMA data to the Fathom data. And this wasn't Fathom doing the analysis. This was the work by the Transportation Planning Board in Washington. And you can see the impact looking at roads, rail stops and rail lines. And of course, it's really identifying those assets, that's going to be impacted by the flooding, and then using that to help plan your strategies and your response tactics around that. Next slide, please.
I now want to talk about how we typically apply flood data and state emergency management planning. And I'll start with a case study of the Utah Enhanced Hazard Mitigation Plan update. We had the pleasure of working with the state of Utah in 2023 and 2024 to not just update their standard hazard mitigation plan for the state, but to try to get them to the enhanced plan status, which was really our role was to help showcase the proactive things the state was already doing in its mitigation program. And one of the things that Utah Emergency Management has within it is the flood mapping program, and they've been also very proactive on the mapping side. But when we did so one of the things we typically do when we look at a state mitigation plan update is what's the status of flood hazard data and how can that inform the risk assessment update. The map shown on the left is basically the status of when we did this. About half the state did not have digital flood products. Those counties shaded in pink basically still had paper flood insurance rate maps or very limited areas mapped. So the other thing that we looked at is applying the best available tools for analyzing risks statewide. So the National Risk Index is a tool that is supported by FEMA, and one of the requirements is to talk about probabilities of flooding. So the map on the right represents the National Risk Index annual probability of floods, with the deeper colored tones showing more frequent flooding events. And when we presented this to the state hazard mitigation team, we said, here's what NRI shows. Is this the reality in your experience? And the answer was yes. That southwestern part of Utah gets influenced by two different phenomena, one being the southwest monsoonal flow in the summer months, but they also get the spillover from the atmospheric rivers that have been impacting the West Coast in the wintertime. So a lot of these same counties that are experiencing increased flooding also do not have very detailed or digital flood mapping at the time. So next slide. A lot of those same counties are also home to some of the more spectacular national parks like Bryce Canyon, Zion, as well as Capitol Reef, which have had some devastating floods in recent years and very popular with tourism and the local economy. So one of the things that we do historically to fill in the gaps with where there isn't digital flood mapping is to use the HAZUS generated flood data. So HAZUS is FEMA's flood risk assessment tool. It does have a modeling, flood modeling ability, but sometimes the accuracy of it leaves things to be desired. But if this map shows an example of Fathom data for Wayne County, and it shows a zoom in on a Hanksville area with where you could see the different gradations in depth. And so had we had access to this data back then, we could have potentially had a more complete picture, not just of the extent of flooding, but as Gavin mentioned, the depth of flooding. So we can use that depth to, and we overlaid this on a state assets layer in GIS. And if we were able to get those depths, we could further refine and prioritize those assets for mitigation purposes. The other thing that could be useful at a statewide scale is having those more frequent return intervals and looking at the assets within, say, the 1 in 25 or the 1 in 50 year event as more likely to get flooded and a prioritized for mitigation. And then finally, having a picture of future conditions would also have been a benefit from the data set that Fathom's providing. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk now about local hazard mitigation planning. We're currently working with Merced County in California, which is located smack in the middle of the state, as well as in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley, which is where a lot of America's food products are grown. So very important agricultural community and economy in that area. And very widespread potential flood. The map shown here is the effective FEMA flood mapping for the area. However, a lot of that area shown in blue is Zone A, which stands for approximate and not based on detailed flood studies, right? So the other issue with the data that's available to us for this study currently is it's still based on 2008 modeling. So they really are in need of an updated flood study for this county, given the risks that they face. Next slide. So one of the things we're looking at is exploring the use of Fathom data to complement and inform the mitigation planning effort in addition to the FEMA risk assessment. So one of the things, as Gavin mentioned, the Fathom data has the pluvial flooding, that area outside of your typical riverine flood hazard area. Also, it has the future conditions, and some of the initial data that we're looking at with Fathom is actually showing a much more detailed and narrower floodplain than the previous Zone A FEMA mapping. So this could help really target those areas at higher risk and inform the mitigation strategies as in a much more comprehensive way than previously. So next slide. You're muted, Gavin.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, so Jeff talked about sort of gaps in flooding data, and some of the work that we have been involved in is at a state level. And one of the examples here is Texas. So on the back of Hurricane Harvey, the Texas government realized that the state was extremely vulnerable to similar costly catastrophic events, and so decided to take a more proactive stance to understand and mitigate the impacts of future flood events. So they tasked the Texas Water Development Board to develop plans and work with the 15 regional flood planning groups to develop a much more local and detailed response to flooding, both now and in the future. So when they looked at the data that was available, they developed what they called a patchwork quilt of data, as you can see here. This shows all the different vintages, the different methodologies, and the different data that was available. But effectively, 60 counties across the state did not have any detailed flood maps. Some of them had paper maps from 20, 30 years ago, but they were effectively null and void. because they were so old. So when they looked at developing data to cover the state, they equated this to a cost of developing the BLE maps for the state for approximately $45 million. And it would have taken sort of 4 or 5, maybe 6 years to develop those data sets for the whole state. So they didn't have time for that. So that's where we effectively stepped in and worked with local organizations to develop a customized statewide flood map. Next slide, please. Showing the developed to both for pluvial, fluvial, and coastal flooding for both the current and future flood states. We worked with the Texas state climatologists specifically to use regional data for the state and modeled that specifically for them. Now, that current view was based on the latest LiDAR data that was captured. We built into a seamless terrain data set for the whole state. We then used that to run that through our automated modeling framework to develop the 100 and 500 year perspective across the state, down at, in this case, it was down at a 3-meter resolution. For the future state, we not only developed the future perspective under a changing climatic conditions, but we also built in a number of other novel things. So we built into the future view the impact of subsidence or subsidence due to oil extraction around the Gulf. We also brought in population changes and urbanization projections from the state. So we were able to provide for 2040 a perspective of not only the changing in flood, but the changing in flood conditions due to climate and urbanization, which was really important to get those future views to build the business case for investment and mitigation of flooding at a very local level. So end to end, the whole project to develop and build those current state of flood maps was less than 6 months for the whole state. Now, those data sets are now out with the regional flood planning groups, both the current and the future data sets are now being deployed on the ground. And I was lucky enough to speak to a number of the teams on the ground there, and they were very grateful to have this detailed data to help them plan not only long-term resilience and infrastructure and mitigation, but also to actually look at responding to the events happening that they have to deal with on a very regular basis. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier a project that we did for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. They had a requirement to effectively map and identify all the critical infrastructure at a state level and determine the impact of that due to flooding and sea level rise, so both pluvial, fluvial, and coastal flooding at a state level. There's something like 3.3 million critical assets that they had to analyze as this part of this comprehensive statewide project. Again, they looked at the data sets at a state level and they had similar issues to Texas. The data sets were incomplete, different vintages, different methodologies, based on different resolution as well. So again, we worked with the state teams there to develop this statewide data set. And in addition to local soil types and again, local LiDAR and flood defense data, we also built in because of the nature of the types of long-term pluvial events in Florida, we were able to build in a 1-day and a 7-day pluvial event specifically for them as part of the mapping data set that we were outputted. So again, we were able to turn this around within a matter of months for the whole state to provide a very quick, comprehensive, consistent view of flood risk, both for current and future climate conditions across the state, that helped turn around the statewide flood vulnerability assessment in very short order. Next slide, please. If we're now looking at a national perspective, we were selected with Aon Impact Forecasting by Public Safety Canada to develop the first national flood hazard data set for Canada. There are obviously a lot of local and regional, provincial data sets, but the government didn't have a consistent view of flood risk, both today and under future climate scenarios for across the whole nation. So we worked with the Public Safety Canada to develop a very detailed data set for the whole of Canada. And again, this was a bespoke or customized data set where we took in localized LiDAR data. We also modeled the impacts of coastal flooding and wave run-up for the Great Lakes as well, which hadn't been done at a national scale. So this data has been developed not only to give the government a much better understanding of flood risk, but importantly, it's been developed, a number of data sets have been developed on the back of this to inform the population and citizens of Canada around their current exposure to flood risk and that future flood risk. So they have developed what they call the FIFRA data set, and that effectively takes in this flood hazard layer and population demographic and vulnerability data to effectively provide a very straightforward matrix traffic light at a national scale for their citizens to understand and help make more informed decisions around flooding both today and in the future. And any government investment project has to be validated against this data set to ensure that it's been future-proofed as well. So we're at very early stages with the adoption of this data. There's lots more we can do working with the Canadian government, but it's a very important validation of the application and use of our data. Next slide, please.
I'd like to showcase another case study in how advanced flood modeling data has been used to support emergency management planning. This project took place in eastern Kentucky, and if you've might have heard in the news in recent years, a series of devastating flash flood events have affected the eastern Kentucky area that has not only been severely damaging but also deadly. And the frequency of this flooding is risen to the level where the Army Corps of Engineers is planning a levee project to protect the town of Paintsville, which is in Johnson County. And as you know, many Army Corps of Engineers levee projects can take several years to in the planning and design stages before it's fully implemented. So they recognize the need. Okay, there's that piece that's needed, but we need something more real time to help us plan for protecting lives and property in the near term, and that's through this flood warning and emergency evacuation plan that was developed. So WSP with Athena, we were hired to help coordinate this project to support both pre and post levee flood hazard mapping, as well as do develop detailed inundation mapping to support evacuation planning. Next slide. The map shown here is the entirety of Johnson County, and we broke the map into a series of grids of which we could develop more detailed inundation and evacuation maps for emergency purposes. So there wasn't a lot of detailed flood mapping available at the time in this county, so we modeled the map also shows the different streams and tributaries that were modeled in addition to the large rivers that were typically a flood risk. The other thing that this informed was the placement of a county-wide sensor network to detect flood flows, as well as a siren network. Next slide. And then the other part of this project was the planning side. So The flood emergency action plan, we tried to break that down into as simple a process as possible so that the emergency managers and first responders could take this detailed flood modeling and have it explained and use very straightforward terms and steps. So basically, we're using this modeling to tell the emergency manager, well, how bad is the flood gonna get, who needs to be notified, where that does the EOC need to be activated and to what level, um, what areas need to be evacuated, and then finally, where do we need to get people out of harm's way? And we also tried to, so the table on the bottom right shows one of the tributary streams with the different severity levels of flood broken down into A being less severe to C being most. So, and then with the understanding that the less severe floods happen more frequently, and we also use the data to model, the impacts at the different levels. So what transportation routes would be inundated, so that first responders could prepare accordingly and get people to safety. Next slide, please. And then the detailed inundation map that we provided to support the emergency action and evacuation plan is shown on the right there, which is basically shows different levels of flooding based on various rainfall predictions. And it also shows where structures are located as well as rally points for safety, because in some cases, these areas are very narrow and there's only limited roads for people to escape on. The map on the bottom right shows fathom modeling of that similar area, which shows the inundation and the depths to be similar in the mapping that we did. And I think what the takeaway from this project was, it still took about 2 years to complete this entire project with the detailed modeling that was done as well as the planning. And a model such as what Fathom provides could have been used, I think, on the front end to help maybe gauge those areas most at risk and be able to target our efforts for the more detailed modeling and determine those areas most at risk. Next slide. So this is our last slide here, and I just want to kind of recap how states can implement these tools. As Gavin has shown, a statewide baseline flood exposure provides a lot of value, and it includes with those different, not just showing the extent of flooding, but the depths of flooding and at varying return intervals. That can really inform more specific and targeted mitigation and response planning. It can really target the need for additional studies potentially and planning and risk assessment in those high risk assessments. Having an understanding of changing future conditions is also something that's really important in this day and age, to be able to have a little bit more of a crystal ball insight into what things are going to look like in the future, and how can we adjust and adapt our emergency planning, response, and mitigation for that. And finally, having a reliable and consistent picture of flood risk at these large scales, but also being able to fill in the gaps is really going to help improve resilience across the nation. So we really appreciate this opportunity to have this dialogue with you, and hopefully we can continue some of the conversation as we transition into the question and answer period. Next slide.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. We do have some questions coming in. Just before we turn to the questions, I'd like to thank everyone today for joining, and just letting you know that both WSP and the team and myself and colleagues at Fathom will be at the mid-term forum in Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks' time. So it'd be really great to catch up with you there face to face. If you've got any particular questions you might want to ask us, so please reach out to us if you'd like to meet up whilst we're there. So we have one question already from Jonathan, looking at how the opportunity to develop data sets that could be used to quickly and accurately estimate flood damage to critical facilities. That's a really good question, and I think it touches on one of the things that we at Fathom are doing. Part of our background, we effectively evolved from the insurance industry. That's where we cut our teeth and developed the business. And so they have used our hazard maps globally for underwriting and pricing purposes. Importantly, we've also developed catastrophic loss models where we're taking the hazard data sets, creating synthetic event sets. So these are millions, a catalogue of millions of events over 10,000 years. And we run those events against particular assets that are presented. And each of those assets we can categorize by whether the type of asset, and from that we can understand the vulnerability to flooding. So through those catastrophe models, we can develop and provide an understanding of loss, financial losses, both at a portfolio level, but also at an individual asset level. And that allows us to also provide some sensitivity analysis to say, okay, actually, if we change the level of protection or for these particular assets, what are the losses going to be? So it gives you a very clear idea on identifying which assets are the loss drivers across your portfolio. Now, one of the things we're in discussions with WSP is we have this framework that allows us to model any assets, and we're developing vulnerability data sets for things like data centers, for example. So we can look at in more detail the impact of specific assets by developing vulnerability data in conjunction with WSP and the engineering teams there. So we have this framework that we can use and we can deploy to calculate losses, both current and under future climate scenarios as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Jeff, and we can certainly pick that up offline if you'd like to know more about it. Okay, I'm not sure if I see any other questions. One of the questions we get asked quite regularly is how do we validate our data? It's all very well showing you nice maps and lots of detail, but actually, how do we validate that, and how do we compare it to FEMA and other data sets? So we've published a lot of our validation. We make that available to people, where we've validated our data against very detailed flood data sets from FEMA at a very local and at a regional level. We've also used the Iowa Flood Center have produced some very detailed maps for the state of Iowa. We benchmark our data against those data sets as well. But importantly, we validate our data sets against real world events. Now, there are a lot of events happening, and you don't always get reliable event data looking at depths and extents of data. But now with, as we've over the last 10 years or so, through the development of remote sensing, we're getting much better data. So that allows us to benchmark against severe events. We've done that for the severe flooding in Germany a couple of years ago. We've done that against some of the severe flooding that you've had in the US, in Virginia and other areas, where we have identified the extent and the depths of some of those events and benchmark them against our data, and we feel we come up pretty good in identifying those flooded areas in our more extreme data sets. sorry, in the more extreme return periods within our data set. So we can make links to those papers available. They're all on our website. Happy to share some links for any of you that want to look at our methodology and the validation of our data in any more detail. Okay. Jeff, I think there's a question about Merced County there.
I'm having trouble seeing the questions. Let's see, here we go. Oh, there we go. Yes, the question on the Merced County hydrologies modeling from 1975 or earlier, and what are the differences seen between fathom deaths and FEMA flood deaths? Great question, and I think what that's something we're still looking at, but a lot of the flood depth in Merced County, since that's so flat, it's generally very shallow flooding of 2 feet depth or less. But that is something that we're going to be looking at as we evaluate the potential use of the Fathom data moving forward.
Okay, there's another question from Janet here. Have you presented your flood scenarios and data to FEMA? What has been the response? And anyone else in a regulatory position? Yeah, we have had a number of conversations with FEMA. And as you're more aware than us, things that have changed, and so some of those conversations with people have obviously moved on, and the landscape's changing. However, we talked about our catastrophe model, and FEMA actually licensed our catastrophe model as part of the NFIP program. So we're now on a framework with FEMA for 5 years, using our model as a blend of models. They use several other models to look at calculating losses to underpin the NFIP. So they are using our data. They're currently evaluating the model, and we are in discussions with FEMA. We've also had some discussions with the US Army Corps as well. And I think it's really balancing that to say, like, how can we complement and support initiatives, rather than compete. And I think from our perspective, that's really important. We're looking to complement, fill in the gaps, and support people that need a more detailed perspective of flood risk across the US.
Can I add on to that, Gavin?
Of course.
One thing also we want to make the audience realize is the modern mapping methods is that FEMA is employing is much more detailed and accurate than in days past. So a lot of the FEMA mapping does employ now the rain on grid 2D mesh, similar to what Fathom is using, and even in that Utah example I provided, the state has been mapping with the base level engineering methods to fill in those gaps pretty rapidly now. So the FEMA maps have evolved. It's just that it's a large country, and we have a lot of maps to do and to update to get it up to that next level.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. So there's some other questions in here. Interesting one from Corey. Based on what you are seeing with your real world flood events in the US and compare it to FEMA's, what are the flood frequencies that you project these floods to be? Do you foresee a new regulatory flood level to be the base flood in the NFIP? Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm not probably the right person to answer that. But of course, we are seeing changes in these types of events, and what effectively could be a 1 in 100 year typical event today over a fairly short period of time could be a one in sort of 70 or 1 in 80 year event, or actually, projecting forward, what does a 1 in 100 year event actually look like? So I think we are seeing changes, and across the US and ultimately globally. We did some work recently in the UK, and it's not a one size fits all. Not everywhere is going to get wetter, and exactly the same in the US. There are going to be some areas that are going to get dry, and so but we'll have more frequent flash flooding rather than riverine flooding. So it's an inconsistent picture across the US and ultimately globally. So there is a lot of uncertainty in that, and certainly in our future projections, we build uncertainty in that to provide the 50th percentile, but also the 17th to the 83rd percentile, which is recommended by the IPCC, to get that broad perspective of likely spread of results. So we do take that into consideration for those future views, and it's really important that we share that with organisations as well. In addition to that, with our data, there is also a metadata layer as well, and that metadata layer also gives you an additional lens to look at. If you're making specific decisions, it gives a confidence index in that as part of the metadata, and that's derived from the data sets that are used for the modelling. So where you've got very recent LiDAR and defence data, you're probably getting probably an 8 or a 9. Where you don't have that data and you're using terrain data, or you've got little confidence around the defence data, then that might be a sort of a 3 or a 4. Now, that's more likely outside of the US because you've got some really good data here. So, but it's another lens to help you interpret the data and make those informed decisions.
I see a question from Jamie on taking into account state efforts to perform base level engineering when discussing availability. And yeah, that's certainly with Utah, you've made great strides. And I know when we started out the mitigation plan for the state, a lot of that was still in process, but that certainly is helping to fill in the gaps. And it's certainly a movement across the US to get a more complete picture of flood risk, particularly in the areas that have lacked mapping in the past and are in more rural. So the picture should be improving as more and more of that BLE data becomes available.
So, Bill provides a very interesting question around, Fathom models clearly valuable for planning and risk identification, but a foundation to achieving resilience is in the flood codes and standards. And of course, the BLE is currently the critical basis for most building codes for public safety. This question is, what opportunities are there to integrate the Fathom resources into federal, state, or local codes to facilitate and enhance resilience now and into the future? Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Bill, and it kind of depends on where we start, at the top, or from a top down, from the federal perspective, or at a local county perspective. I think it's probably not a question we can answer directly. I think part of that is working with federal agencies and working with our colleagues in WSP to engage with them, but also at a more local level to say, actually, how can this type of data be used to help inform and make better decisions, whether that's going to be built in as a regulatory or a standard code. That's probably going to take some time, but I think what we're saying here is this complements people to have a wider or deeper perspective, and ideally, it would be great to get that rolled into more of the the statutory codes or building codes, but I think that that'll take some time, and it'll be interesting to see how the data is used and gets adopted for these types of applications.
I might add on to that one. With the understanding FEMA's flood hazard mapping is for regulatory purposes. And so we don't envision that changing anytime soon. And that's kind of, I think, the main difference here between the FEMA products and Fathoms is, FEMA is for regulatory, Fathom is for planning and risk assessment. And I think there's, two complementary types
Mhm.
of mapping that's being done here.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I think that's most of the questions we've answered. Any other questions before we close? Yeah, and Bill has said yes. A significant portion of FEMA's losses are in unmapped areas, and we highlighted that as part of the stats we demonstrated earlier, that a large proportion of those losses are in those unmapped areas, and it's trying to provide that consistent view of flood risk to inform a whole range of different practitioners, not just in emergency management, planning and resilience, and across the whole piece, but it's particularly important in these areas. And yeah, as Bill said, the best available information is needed. So yeah, it's part of the reason we're talking to you today with the likes of Jeff to put that data into context and see how it can be applied for the typical applications that you guys are dealing with on a regular basis. So I'm not sure there's any other questions. Jeff, did you want to say a few words just to sum up?
Just really appreciate this opportunity, and again, happy to continue, more conversations and questions as needed if in the future, and perhaps at NEMA as well. So again, appreciate folks tuning in today.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And yeah, those of you going to be at the midterm forum in DC, we look forward to seeing you there. And hopefully, it's not going to be too cold. It's getting warm over here, so hopefully, it's going to warm up a bit for us Brits coming over. But thank you for your time, and thank you, Karen, for organising things today.
You're so welcome. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Gavin, for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you to our great audience for participating and for joining us. We're so grateful that you took the time to spend with us today and hope you're leaving with new knowledge and skills to take back to your organizations. You can find out more about the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series and how to sponsor one of your own at the NEMA website, www.nemaweb.org. It's in the resources section. As a reminder, a short survey will be sent to you via email, and we would appreciate your feedback. The webinar recording will be available on the NEMA YouTube channel in a few days. It's NEMA for You is the name of the channel. Thank you again for attending. Take care, stay well, and have a productive rest of your day. Bye, everyone.